We're going to go through the basics of the benefit cost analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, and cost analysis, just the basics. The lesson from the course, a sort of a meta lesson, is that what we're going to do is pretty much do a very basic idea, and then we're just going to do it again in more detail, and then do it again in more detail, and then do it again in more detail. And the reason being that it's slightly different every time, so you need to kind of iterate through your versions. And so this is just to get us on the very first starting, like blank sheet of paper, benefit cost analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, cost analysis, the terms and the key ideas. Now, Meredith has already been on my case about the slides. She says the slides have to correspond to the slides that I give you. I can't do that. And the reason I can't do that is because we try to make this course useful for you guys, and so that involves a little bit of improvisation in the slides. And so I'm improvising in the slides as I go along. I tell Meredith it's like jazz. She rolls her eyes, but it's kind of like jazz. So the slides do not correspond to your slides. However, at the end of the course, you will get everything. All the slides, all the Excel spreadsheets, all the documents, all the answers, everything in a big zip file. So you won't miss anything. It'll all be given to you at the end of the course, kind of in a summary. I'm going to try to do it day by day, but anyway, there's nothing on the slides that you won't eventually get. Meredith's not even here to listen to that, so I'm not really sure what the point of that was. Everything will be available, okay? Including some of the things you follow up. If we have articles that we refer to, we can pinch those in. So, cost analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, benefit cost analysis. We're just going to go through four main ideas. The first one is the basics, so we all understand what each term means and where it applies. The second is that this doesn't make any sense unless you put it into your theory of change, theory of action when you're evaluating something. It's going to be very difficult to just say, oh, I'll just do a benefit cost analysis. It has to be put inside your theory of change, theory of action, whatever you want to call it. The third thing, which is a little bit embarrassing given that we've got you here for a whole week, is we're going to try to keep it as simple as possible. The reason being that even when we read benefit cost analyses, you look at the final result and you sort of understand it, but then as you go deeper into it, you really figure out what is inside the statistics, what is inside the interpretation of the numbers. So the very first thing we like to do is try to present a very basic idea of our structure of the results and the analysis. And then the fourth thing I'll talk about is that the purpose of benefit cost analysis, at least, if not necessarily cost effectiveness analysis, but certainly benefit cost analysis is supposed to improve decision making. If it doesn't help you make a decision, you don't need to do it. So I've pretty much given up doing early childhood benefit cost analyses. It's like goldfish in a barrel type thing. They're so easy to do. The results are so good. The benefits are so high. And even if they weren't, we're talking about a low-income group of kids who typically don't get a lot of other investments. So even if you had something that didn't look good from an economic perspective, you could still do it. So the purpose of benefit cost analysis, certainly, and probably cost effectiveness analysis, and ideally cost analysis, is to improve policy making. If it doesn't improve policy making, we're not going to do it. Now, that's changing how we think about this approach. And we're going to go through this during the week because you guys are all researchers, so you're all living and dying by your statistical significance and your asterisks. And I am too. I love my asterisks. I'm starting to sound like Donald Trump, aren't I? I love my asterisks. They're great. We're not in the asterisks world here. We're in the world of policy making. Are we going to help people make the right policy decision? Okay, so I'm going to go through each of these things, and it's going to serve as an overview to the entire topic. So the basics, just the fundamental basics of the idea. The basics of cost analysis is we're just going to figure out if we can afford this thing, whatever it is. So we're going to describe all the resources we need to deliver a program, and we're going to assume that there are going to be a lot of situations where we simply can't afford to deliver this program, either at scale or with fidelity to some sort of program design. And we can apply cost analysis to a lot of different educational interventions. So we can think about vouchers, giving kids vouchers as a way simply to save money. It's not an issue of effectiveness primarily. You could interpret it purely as this could save money. In which case you would want to look at, does it save money? MOOCs, you might remember MOOCs. They're so 2015. MOOCs, mass online, what is it, open? Mass open online courses? MOOCs. They're mass online open courses. You can teach millions of students from your portal. So the argument is simply, it doesn't matter if you hire a Nobel laureate. Once you divide that by 1 million, a Nobel laureate is very low cost as a professor. So you could try to explain that argument. And then you could think about reallocation programs. So changing a school around to make it seem more like a school within a school rather than a big school. So there are a lot of different ways in which your primary focus is just, what does this thing cost? And that is a useful exercise in itself and may be sufficient. We have lots of cases where things simply cost too much, like the famous class size in California experiment. Class size is a good idea. Turns out it's very expensive. You can allocate a small amount of money and see what happens, that type of thing. You could think about something like the Abecedarian program, which is very, very expensive. Can you afford to implement that? Not in a lot of contexts. So that would be our first step at cost analysis, our first set of analysis. Our second analysis is just to extend that and say, if we've done our cost analysis, can we relate that to a set of educational outcomes that we wish to obtain? And we're going to look at programs and see if they work at what cost. So the What Works Clearinghouse, we would like it to be called the What Works at What Cost Clearinghouse. And we can see lots of examples here of educational programs where they are probably high cost, but that is going to influence their effects. So reducing class size is very expensive, even if it has big effects. Something like a new curricula, we can think, well, this is probably you're just changing your textbook. If Rob was here, he would tell me, what's the alternative to Saxon math? Saxon math is, what is it, everyday math? Saxon math, everyday math, you just change the textbook. Those are going to be extremely low cost, and therefore we wouldn't expect them to have a very large effect at all. And if it was me, I would probably say, and I guess some people would agree with us, Brooks, maybe, that a lot of interventions are simply way too cheap for what they are trying to do, too low cost. Do you really think you're going to be offsetting family disadvantage or student behavior with Saxon math? It's probably not going to happen. Saxon math is just a veneer on top of all the issues that kids have to deal with. And the one that is probably the most recent is when I look at breakfast in the classroom. Breakfast in the classroom is breakfast in the classroom as opposed to breakfast in the cafeteria. And you're thinking, well, breakfast in the classroom sounds great. More kids get breakfast. the sugar is coursing through them, so they're all ready to learn and they're good to go. But breakfast in the classroom and breakfast in the cafeteria, the difference between those is probably like 50 cents in terms of the cost of those things. Breakfast in the classroom is expensive, breakfast in the cafeteria is expensive. The difference in costs is actually pretty small. And given that breakfast is only one meal of the day, it seems unlikely that spending 50 cents more on a particular delivery of food would do anything to childhood obesity rates. It seems unlikely that that would happen. So I think one of the things we do when we read through the literature is we think, this thing is really, if this works, it's a real bargain, because it seems like there's not a lot of resource or extra resource being put into something. And then the last one is, if we look at something like mentoring. Mentoring is like a piece of string. You can have a lot of mentoring, you can have a little bit of mentoring. So the idea of mentoring is not a fixed concept for us, and so we would want to look at the variation in mentoring in relation to the variation in the variation in the effects of mentoring relative to the variation in the costs of mentoring. The bottom line for cost effectiveness, we could do a cost effectiveness analysis of pretty much anything. Benefit cost analysis is very different from cost effectiveness analysis. Hank said this already. Benefit cost analysis, which, believe it or not, we prefer to call benefit cost analysis than cost benefit analysis. And believe it or not, somebody did write a paper on that. Benefit cost analysis. Benefit cost analysis says, let's look at the costs of our program and let's look at the consequences if this program is implemented, or the consequences if it's not implemented. So in other words, we're going to take our analysis of a program and we're going to look at what happens after the program. And we're going to measure this all in money terms. So you can think about programs like youth support programs, which might be high cost, but will save us on expenses on future incarceration. And obviously the early education literature is predicated on, yes, it's worth spending $15,000 on Perry Preschool, or $45,000 on Abecedarian, or $18,000 on the Chicago program, because later on we're going to get a whole array of benefits. Pretty straightforward. But these are three different things that we're going to do. Now, we have to put these into our theory of change, these three forms of analysis. And the theory of change, you can choose any theory of change. This is one from the JPAM paper by Brock, Weiss, and Bloom from 2015, I think, 2015, the JPAM paper. We have a treatment which is somehow, whatever it is, somehow going to improve teacher knowledge. That teacher knowledge is then going to improve teacher practices and classroom outcomes, and that link is then going to improve student achievement. And we could cut to the chase and we could just go from treatment to student achievement, but for us it's very helpful to go through A, B, and C. Go through each link of the chain to see how cost benefit and if cost effectiveness benefit cost analysis fit into this. So obviously when we're thinking about the costs, we're thinking about the costs of the treatment. So what do we need to implement? What resources are we going to use to implement this treatment? Whatever it is, it looks like a professional development for teachers. Whatever that professional development costs us, we're going to cost that out here. And then so we would just figure out how much it costs and if we can afford it, and then we would go all the way to the end and say what achievement gains are we going to get from this treatment. So we could go straight from A to D in terms of our effectiveness, and then literally we're just going to compare the two. It's that simple. Now the reason why we put it in our theory of change is because we don't have to use student achievement as our measure of effectiveness. We could We could use improved teacher practices, or we could use classroom outcomes. We could use either of those as our measures of effectiveness. And we could even use improved teacher knowledge as our measure of effectiveness. Cost effectiveness analysis is great because you can use any measure of effectiveness you want. So we would just relate what the program costs to the effect of the program relative to some counterfactual. Pretty straightforward. Now, if we're doing benefit cost analysis, we're still going to estimate our costs, but we're going to estimate this thing, student achievement, in dollars somehow. So we're going to have to put a dollar value on student achievement. Which you could spend a long time doing, or you could use somebody else's estimates, and we'll talk about that on Thursday, I think, Brooks. Wednesday afternoon? Wednesday afternoon. Wednesday afternoon. We're going to have to value student achievement in dollar terms. Now, we have A, B, and C mechanisms, so we have these other things too, and these things might be worth something to us as well. So this might have a value in dollars, and it might have a value in dollars because teachers like doing things that work, or teachers realize that they've assigned homework that they then have to grade, and that homework was pointless, so why would you assign homework that you then need to grade, which is unnecessary? So that would save you time. Or alternatively, you could think of student behavior as improving, and then student behavior is something that you don't have to spend time on disruptive protocols for kids, or pulling them out of class, or meeting with parents afterwards. So there are potentially all sorts of benefits that could be in here as well as in there. And then there might even be some benefits in here in terms of improved teacher knowledge. Maybe there are some spillovers. Maybe teachers who feel good about their skills are more likely to stay in the job. The bottom line for benefit cost analysis is that there might be situations where we want to add up all of these different effects and count them all together, rather than just pick one of them, but count them all together. And so we need our theory of change to understand if this is worth anything, if this is worth anything, if this is worth anything to us in money terms. Now, how are we going to value student achievement? Well, we're going to have to collapse this thing a little bit, and our easiest go-to is we're just going to say, how much more do you earn if you are a student with higher achievement? And so we're somehow going to have to extrapolate from here to here. And extrapolation is okay for us. We don't have to follow you through your life. We can just make some modeling assumptions that kids who do better on the SAT are more likely to complete college. Completing college is associated with higher earnings. This much higher earnings, this many students complete college. So this can all be extrapolated. It doesn't have to be measured. But what does have to be measured properly is this thing. And there has to be a relationship between this thing, student achievement, and higher earnings. And that's something we get all the time as economists, is what am I supposed to measure here that's going to correspond to some economic value at the end? Now, that is one type of value for our program. We expand the program back out. We could easily think of improved teacher practices and classroom outcomes generating some value to us in dollar terms. It might be that parents are willing to pay more for classrooms that are calmer or better run, or the students feel that are more successful. As I mentioned, you might have some money savings in school counselors, so you can think about lower levels of disruption in the classroom. And then you can also think about saving money on teacher pay. Teacher pay is typically lower in classrooms that are less disruptive. And so you could think about buying disruption as a way of reducing your teacher wage bill. We're pretty agnostic about whether these are good or bad ways to save money. If they save money, they're good ways to save money. There are no bad ways to save money here in this kind of framework. So, it's starting to get a little bit more complicated with benefit cost analysis, and it's going to get more complicated because we're going to want to add these two things up. We're going to have to add them up in our framework. And we really cannot understand them without this theory of change. We're really not going to be in a position to understand where we're getting our money benefits from without this theory of change. And maybe some of these are worthless. Maybe making teachers happier is not worth it for a school district. For us, it's an economic question. For the teachers, it's a what is it? Metaphysical question? Moral question? Happiness question? Metaphorical? Could be anything. For us, it's just an economic question. Do we have to pay them more if they're unhappy? Or do we have to recruit more of them because they keep leaving because they're unhappy? Why are they unhappy? Because we never trained them in ways that made the classroom non-disruptive. So we could do this entirely. We could forget about student achievement and we could do this entirely within the classroom. And that would be something that you would think the socio-emotional skills would be good at. So socio-emotional skills are about presumably behaving well in the classroom. I'm assuming. Michael, are they? Who knows? Nobody's behaving well in the classroom. So if we ever find somebody who does behave well in the classroom, we'll know. But if they're about behaving well in the classroom, there might not be anything to do with test scores. You might think, who cares about test scores or achievement or IQ? I just want them to all sit down calmly and, not disrupt the classroom. And that might be worth a lot because, as you know, there are a lot. Each school district has a kind of a quasi-police force which is required to calm down all these disputes. So you might think that I don't even need to go this far. I don't even need to worry about this. I can just focus on this. And that obviously reduces the amount of data you have to collect. It reduces the time frame that you're thinking about this problem over. And it reduces any concern about how these other things relate. And I think our work on socio-emotional learning would suggest that you really do just want to focus on this very short window and don't worry too much about what happens a long time down the road. That's an empirical question. But certainly we could think about a benefit cost. We could think about putting things in dollar terms as very immediate, having very immediate consequences without worrying too much about student test scores. And we'll talk a little bit about this later because, of course, the terrible thing for us in education research is fade out. You get some gains and then you're, oh dear, they've gone. Well, in the benefit cost framework, you only have to get gains here. It doesn't matter if they're gone later on. If they're gains that were worth it in the time frame that we were looking at, that's fine. So we have an easy out. We don't have to worry about fade out because we have a way of dealing with fade out. We're expecting everything to fade out. We'll come on to this in more detail when we do benefit cost analysis. Now, we're going to be a little economicsy number crunchy here, and we're not really going to say that knowledge has any value. I know. I'm glad Mary, I get in trouble a lot. Brooks is here, so I'm already in trouble. We're going to say that knowledge does not, it's not that it doesn't have any economic value, It's that we can't give it an economic value. We have to look at a behavioral change to infer a knowledge change. So knowing, what's his name, Galileo? He was the one who got in trouble for knowledge. Well, now we're all in trouble for knowledge. But anyway, knowing something is not an economic concept. You have to do something. We're really in a world of revealed preference, if you remember that from your textbooks, revealed behavior. So the improved teacher knowledge is going to be very hard for us to think about in a benefit cost analysis where we want to put everything in money terms. Knowledge is not a thing that's easy to monetize. Behavior conditional on knowledge is fine, but behavior is not very easy, knowledge is not very easy to monetize. That's a big step. Part of the course is laying out what we do as in benefit cost analysis. It's not necessarily the right thing, but it's how it's how we kind of work. So we're not suggesting it's the right way to do something. It's just this is how we're going to think if we use this method. Okay. Now, we're going to make our first clear distinction between cost effectiveness and benefit cost analysis. They use similar cost methods, but they differ significantly in how you're going to value the outcomes of a project. In other words, the benefits are not the same as the costs in all sorts of ways. And so then this raises a question of which one are you going to do, cost effectiveness analysis or benefit cost analysis? And you can do both, but it's not very helpful to think about doing both because you're going to have to collect different data for benefits and different data for effects and slightly different data for costs. So it's really much better to decide whether you want to do a cost effectiveness analysis or a benefit cost analysis. And there are a lot of reasons to make that determination. And a first fundamental decision rule as to which one to choose is, are you trying to compare something to something else? If you're trying to compare something to something else, you can probably get away with cost effectiveness analysis. Now, you might be comparing something to a whole range of other analyses that have taken place. So you could have a math curriculum which is supposed to boost math achievement, and you might want to compare that to all the other previous math curricula that were ever implemented in the district. In which case, you're probably going to want to select cost effectiveness analysis. So the first thing is, are we doing a comparative analysis or are we doing a kind of a standalone, what does this thing look like by itself analysis? If we're doing a comparative analysis, we're going to want to choose cost effectiveness. If we're doing more of a standalone analysis, we're going to try to do benefit cost analysis. Now, when we talk about this a little later, the cost effectiveness has a particular assumption built into it, which is going to make cost effectiveness generally less attractive than benefit cost analysis, generally less attractive. But you can do either, or you could, if you had a lot of time and energy, do both of those. Obviously, the early childhood people like to do benefit cost analysis because you have lots of different things that could happen. Socio-emotional learning, you have lots of different things that could happen. It's not just achievement, it's externalizing behavior, internalizing behavior. Is there another form of bad behavior? I'm pretty sure my kids, it's not just two forms of bad behavior. I'm pretty sure there are multiple forms. There's internalizing, externalizing, there's achievement, there's, what are the other ones? Control skills or regulation, emotional regulation. All of those different things Now, if you can collapse them into a single measure, you can really run with cost-effectiveness analysis. But if these have lots of different implications for behavior, you're going to think, I need to capture all of those. And that's going to be more like benefit-cost analysis. So, we'd prefer to choose one or the other when we start this out. Now, as I've said, structuring and framing this in relation to the theory of change is critical, in part because nobody can really understand what you've done if you don't embed this into the theory of change. And also because if you sort of flip between cost effectiveness and benefit cost analysis, everything starts to get very confusing as to what is a cost and what is an effect. So we really do want to keep this very simple when we start out to do this for our framework. And so for our cost analysis, we're just going to list every single cost that is incurred, all the resources that are required to implement the policy. And we could do this either for 2 different policies, or we can do it as incremental costs for one policy over the next policy. And we like to refer to this as the costs of a treatment, even if it's not a randomized controlled trial, over business as usual. And we find the phrase business as usual is helpful because business as usual implies that there's something actually going on absent the treatment. And what a lot of research, not so much now, but 10 years ago did, was basically assume that you either got the treatment or you did nothing. Nothing was happening to you. You were in a youth support program like Youth Build or what's the other one? Youth Job Corps. You were either in that program or you were just standing still, never moving for 3 years as a youth. So we like to emphasize that business as usual is what you would have got if you hadn't got the treatment. And therefore what we're interested in is not the cost of the treatment, but the cost of the treatment relative to business as usual. And for our world, it's perfectly symmetric. It doesn't matter whether you tell me what the treatment is, and then you tell me what the control group is. It doesn't matter whether you flip those and you told me that the control was the treatment and the treatment was the business as usual. Both are as important to us. It's as important to know what the business as usual is as it is to know what the treatment group is getting in terms of resources. And this is critical for youth programs, but it's also critical for early childhood. So you can think of youth programs. You're in a youth program. What would you be doing if you weren't in the youth program? Would you be working? Maybe if you're working, working is actually better than being in a youth program. You're generating some taxes for the local government or something. Or maybe you'd be incarcerated, in which case there's a big problem. Now we've got all sorts of different costs. And then you could see this for Head Start. So the study of Head Start, the Klein and Walters study of Head Start said, if you compare Head Start to a control group, Head Start doesn't look very good. But then when you realize that the control group are getting a lot of resources, then what you should be comparing is the difference in the resources for Head Start versus the control group, not just the difference in outcomes, but the difference in resources. And if the difference in resources is very small, you wouldn't expect the difference in outcomes to be very big. Not rocket science. I saw a t-shirt, not rocket surgery, somebody had put on their t-shirt. Not rocket surgery, not rocket science, but kind of comes from putting this in the context of what are you comparing against what. Now, the ingredients method says we're going to distinguish the costs of something in terms of the price of each ingredient and the quantity, and Brooks is going to go through this all tomorrow. And we're going to report the total cost and the average cost per enrollee for our program, our intervention, our reform. And here, this is a little bit lexically annoying, because if you're an economist, you think about cost per unit of output. But here we're thinking about cost per enrollee in the program. We haven't got anything out of these people yet, these enrollees, these students. This is how much we spend per student or per cohort, not per graduate or per test-taking success or per college graduate or per successful participant, simply per person to whom we deliver the program. That makes a big difference. Now, it's all supposed to look very simple, and it's really just supposed to look this simple. We have our mentoring program for high school seniors. There are 500 students in the program. We go to our school district and we say, how many teachers do you need? And they say 4 teachers, and each teacher has to be paid $100,000. And we need 4 classrooms, and each classroom is $25,000. So we just report that in a simple table. And then we add it up. I know. I teach this at graduate school as well, across the road. It's supposed to be that simple. Now, we could do the same for an after-school program. Oh, well, we can take so the average cost is simply the total cost divided by the number of students. We could do the same for our after-school program. For our after-school program, it doesn't matter that the scale is a little different, 1,000 students instead of 500. We're going to need 6 counselors, and we're going to need a gym. And so we're going to add those amounts up, total them, divide them by the number of school kids, participants, and get the average cost. It's supposed to look like that by the end, nice and simple. And so we're just going to say something very straightforward. Our mentoring program costs $1,000 per student, and our after-school program costs $600 per student. That's it.
Is this a real cost or shadow cost or opportunity cost?
Well, we don't have to worry too much about these numbers today, but these are supposed to be opportunity costs. So this number seems a lot, but then when you realize that the teacher has to be paid to do something that they would have otherwise not wanted to do, so it's a lot of money, so it's the opportunity that they're giving up is that they now have to become mentors as well as teachers. So this number should be an opportunity cost. All of them should be. Now often they are kind of budget numbers that are kind of manipulated a little bit, but we'll talk about that tomorrow. Purely in terms of doing the analysis, it's just supposed to look like that. That's it. You can't go home. You've still got to stay for the rest of the time. Now, one of the reasons why we need to keep this simple is because in these interventions we have a lot of induced costs. Induced costs. And induced costs are costs that occur as a result of the treatment happening, causing you to spend some money somewhere else. So if we look back at our theory of change, our theory of change said this is what the treatment cost, so that would be like the $1,000 or the $600, but there's a whole array of possible extra costs we're on the hook for, induced costs, and those could be all over the place. So we could have, if the teacher is a better teacher, the teacher assigns more homework, the kids go to the library after school, they have to spend more library time, so the students are in school longer. If the teacher realizes that they're not assigning enough quizzes, then the teacher has to do more. There has to be more homework done, so that means more grading. The teachers realize that if they're effective with their new knowledge, they can boost outcomes, so they actually spend a little bit more time in the classroom, work or time prepping for class. Or maybe the professional development is about communication between staff within the school, in which case the professional development says, you know what, if you're a teacher, your improved teacher knowledge says that if you have a problem, you get to talk to the principal. You can't like send the kid to the back of the class. In which case now you've got the principal involved in this. None of this was a treatment cost. This was all an induced cost as a result of the treatment. And you've somehow got to, you need to measure this. And you're not going to know what it is unless you've written out your theory of change. And we're going to do a nice one this afternoon for developmental education on this. I just threw that one in, Brooks. And potentially this could be as large as this, or maybe it's even a negative number, I don't know. Okay, now, if we're doing cost effectiveness analysis, we're going to compare policy alternatives, and we're going to have to go use for our comparison what we call a unidimensional measure of effectiveness. Maybe that's not the right word exactly. It has to be a single number. It could be a single number composed of lots of different things. On base plus slugging percentage. Yeah? On base plus slugging. Everybody's from North Carolina. There isn't a baseball team in, is there? Do you have a, no? The Durham Bulls. On base plus slugging is like some sort of composite thing of what I don't know. Anyway, it has to be, at the end, it has to be a single number. It can be composed of lots of different numbers, like your GPA, but at the end, it has to be cumulative GPA. It has to be a single number. And that is a lot of what we wrestle with in cost effectiveness analysis, is how can we get a single number to represent socio-emotional skills? And if we can't do that, we've got a problem. And now, this unidimensional measure has to capture all of the goals of the program. So immediately, cost effectiveness analysis is, you can see why it's kind of difficult to do. And we'll talk about ways we can get around that later in the week. But fundamentally, you're really supposed to just need one number. So the guys who are in the health, you're in the health? School of Health at Yale, is that right? School of Medicine. Yeah. You guys are super lucky because you have one number, one metric, one measure, qualies, that everybody seems to be okay with. At least the journals do, and they're all that matters. If we don't have qualies or darlies, we're in trouble. Now, if we can find this unidimensional measure of effectiveness for a program, it's pretty straightforward to do our cost effectiveness analysis. We're just going to take our simple cost analysis, and we're going to say that we've got a baseline high school dropout rate of 20%. We're going to scale the school so it's only 500 students. And we're going to compare our mentoring program, which we costed out on Tuesday at $1,000 per student, with our after-school program, which we costed out at $600 per student. And then we're going to get the dropout rates for each of these two programs. And we're going to assume that the only purpose of these programs is to reduce the dropout rate. That's the only purpose. These numbers are all made up, but ultimately when you get to the end of your research, you're going to kind of have a mean treatment effect and an estimated cost. So it's supposed to be this simple. You have 500 students, cost per student. We already did that on the previous slide. This program, you've got 100 baseline dropouts, 20% of the school. This mentoring program reduces the dropout rate by 5%. I got that from the Journal of Advanced Dropout Studies, which did a effectiveness, efficacy trial. For us, it doesn't really matter where we got this from as long as we believe it. In which case, we've got a yield of 5 new high school graduates. And then the after school, and then we could take the cost effectiveness ratio simply 500,000 divided by 5 is 100,000. And then the after school program, we said was $600 per student. Somebody did an evaluation of that, found that it reduced the dropout rate by 2%. The program costs 300,000 scaled to the right size of the school. We've got 100 dropouts, it's the same baseline dropout rate, and we've got 2 new graduates out of this 100 dropouts. We spent $300,000 in total, so our cost effectiveness ratio is 150.
Is it important to test for statistical significance and get our asterisks? I mean, for something like this, would we want to be able to say that the mentoring program is significantly more effective? Or are we just say what it costs and leave it at that?
Okay, that's a very good question. I wish you had asked me that 2 years ago, because then I would have known the answer. I would have known the answer. Now I don't know the answer. I used to know the answer, but now I don't. So I'm going backwards. Now, traditionally, we would say yes, these need to be statistically significant differences. Traditionally, we would have said yes. And for cost effectiveness analysis, we probably would say yes. So these have to be genuinely different numbers. And this has to be a genuinely different cost number. Now,
I'm only allowed to talk about things that are statistically significant. I mean, that's just the way my boss says. If it's not statistically significant difference, just shut up.
okay, well, he's probably an editor of a journal at this rate, because it's the same type of thing. Everybody is obsessed with statistical significance. Now, we can jazzify the course.
If I showed him that, he said, just might be a normal fluctuation in the...
That's true. Now, where are we? Okay.
Oh, I screwed up the whole class now.
No, we're playing along here. We were going to go with the saxophone, but the piano is fine. Now, according to the American Statistical Associate, the American Statistician, which is bedtime reading for all of us, last year they announced their statement, which said, scientific conclusions and business or policy decisions should not be based only on whether a p-value passes a specific threshold. A p-value or statistical significance does not measure the size of an effect or the importance of a result. Now, the trouble is they didn't tell us what we were supposed to do. So it's like, you guys, you're doing it all wrong. Bye, see you later. So, now, so right now we're kind of in like a space-time continuum of we're waiting for somebody to tell us exactly what we are supposed to do.
Okay.
Now, for cost effectiveness, this is going to be a long answer. Notice what they emphasize here is business or policy decisions. So in other words, for us, because I've emphasized we're interested in policy, we are more focused on believing this null statement, because they deliberately include business or policy decisions on the grounds that if you go shopping and you buy some apples and you spend $10, and then somebody else goes and they buy exactly the same apples and spends $5, you're going to be annoyed with yourself for spending twice as much on the same apples. And no amount of somebody saying, well, it's not statistically significantly different, 5 and 10. No amount of that is going to help you feel better about yourself.
Right.
So, for us, we're going to say, let's not worry too much about statistical significance. Let's worry much more about if we were worried about what would happen here if we were worried about this. So in other words, you could say to your boss, yeah, well, it might not be right, but it's still, $1,000 a kid is still $1,000 a kid. And, I might be pretty imprecise in that, but it's still going to be a positive number, and it's better to have some savings than no savings. The full text is given here.
Can I add to that just one thing? In the conversation, particularly with bosses who are completely infatuated with asterisks, one counter argument can be is that, okay, so you gave me $1,000 to run a trial on an implementation study. In that money, I could recruit 50 kids. I found this effect size. It's not statistically significant, right? If you want your asterisks, give me 400,000. I will recruit 500 kids, and then for this effect size, I'm pretty sure I will have the significant p-value because the p-value is sort of directly related to your sample size.
But the way we do it, if the effect size, if we don't have the p-value, we don't even look at the effect size.
Well, but in
We
some
stop
sense,
there.
it is really bad science because when you have a deliberately underpowered study, you should look at the effect size, knowing clearly well that this effect size is not all and be all, but you would not detect effect size that is statistically significant unless it was a huge effect size of 0.8.
Well, I mean,
Right,
we
so-
do look at effect size, but only if we've got the p-value, then we take that step. But see, the other thing, I work for a giant school district. We have 178 schools, and so my statistics work really, really well because we have such great big numbers. You know, I mean, we have more teachers than most districts have students. So, I mean, I can usually find something, you know, I usually can find statistically significance.
Okay. It was a good question. Unfortunately, it opened up a huge can of worms. So let's just go with, we've identified we now have a can of worms on the table, which we were going to deal with on Wednesday and Thursday. But you've drawn our attention to the fact that it is sitting there and we're going to have to deal with it. So we can just sort of, it's there, and there's certainly no agreed upon answer, which is why I wish you'd asked me this question a few years ago, because there would have been an agreed upon answer. It might have been wrong, but it would have been agreed upon. So we're going to come back to that, but it is a problem. It's not a settled thing for us, and I don't think it's a settled thing for anybody either, but it's certainly not settled for us.
Well, I don't want to.
Okay, we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it. So, leaving aside statistical significance or otherwise, we're just going to look at this and we're going to say, look, we've spent $500,000, we bought 5 new graduates. We spent $300,000, we bought 2 new graduates. Therefore, the cost per graduate, per new graduate, is cheaper with the mentoring program than the after-school program. Now, when we say that, we have to be very clear what we're doing, because this is a program that's incremental to the regular school day. There's always going to be some incremental at the bottom of it. So what we would say is, compared to schools with no add-on services, the cost per new high school graduate is $100,000 with the mentoring program. And we're going to condition it on the fact that the scale might make a difference, and the baseline graduation rate is probably going to make a difference. So you can think about delivering a abecedarian to middle-income kids and low-income kids. You can have a different effect and also a different cost. And then we're going to say the mentoring program is more cost-effective than the after-school program at increasing high school graduation rates. So that's our interpretation of cost-effectiveness analysis. Now, benefit-cost analysis, we're going to think of our programs purely as investments. We're going to monetize all the effects, and we're going to call those monetized effects benefits, and we're going to report this as a social rate of return on investment. So if we go back to our example, we've got our mentoring program. We have the effectiveness of the program. We're just going to focus on the mentoring program, not the after-school program. We have the effectiveness of the program, 5% yield of new high school graduates. We have the cost of the program, which we said was $500,000 from last time. Now we're going to figure out what is a high school graduate worth. And we're going to say a high school graduate is worth, in terms of the benefits, their high school graduates earn $120,000 more than dropouts, and they save taxpayers $30,000 in spending on the criminal justice system. Don't have to worry too much about where they get those numbers from right now, but if we have those two numbers, and we believe that this program reduces the dropout rate by 5%, we're just going to figure out that each one of our graduates has an economic value of 600 plus 150. This gives me 750. I'm going to compare that to the costs of 500 to get my net benefits. And then I'm going to take the ratio of B over C. 750 over 500 is 150. You still can't go home. That's it. That's our benefit cost ratio, or our net benefits, benefit cost ratio. Now, as Hank mentioned, we do prefer investments where benefits exceed the costs. we do have a problem here that the benefits do not necessarily have to accrue to any given person. They can accrue to everybody. So you can think about the trouble with looking at socio-emotional investments is if you're just looking at the kid, what about all the other kids that are affected by the investment? If somebody's acting out, there's 29 other people who are affected. We're going to count everybody and we're going to add them all up together. And certainly these benefits are going to be benefits that we are predicting, not measured. So we're going to infer from your educational qualifications the monetary benefits that are going to flow from that. Okay, we got 15 minutes left. So the goal is we're trying to be improve policy making. And we can go to the federal law for that, which I'll just skip over. The federal statute, at least pre-Trump, pre-President Trump, I should probably still say, pre-Trump, used to be this. We're going to propose or adopt a regulation or investment or reform or program based upon a reasoned determination that its benefits justify its costs. So a reasoned determination, not a numerical number necessarily, but a reasoned determination. So you get the numbers and then you reason with them. You don't just put them down and say, oh look, 2 is bigger than 1. We're going to go for after school, not mentoring. You put them down, then you reason with them. Now, as you mentioned, we are not focused on hypothesis testing. We're really not. We have to do something with it, but for us, it's not our live or die thing. We're focused on policy relevance, and we think that we think that this policy relevance is going to matter even if we don't even look at these things. So in other words, we could do our benefit cost analysis and it's helpful for policy making, but we think it's helpful in a lot more general ways because the laws of economics are kind of perpetually biting up against us in all sorts of ways. And so we can see that in a nice example, which was a very expensive and very complicated evaluation of reading recovery, which for those of you who are reading experts will have to tell me what reading recovery is, but it's a program to help students read. And it's a very complicated program, but when you read the review, when you read the evaluation, you realize that there's a lot of economics built into this evaluation, built into the kind of the success of the program. And so the reading recovery deliverers, schools and districts said, well, one of the problems with implementing this was that they thought it was going to be too expensive to adopt. And then others of them said that given that we face our budget constraint, even if it wasn't very expensive, we can't afford to spend any extra money on anything. And especially given the cost per student, that we're only serving a few students, this program's starting to look not very attractive to us as a district. And our administrators are giving us all this pushback about our financial concerns for reading recovery as a program to implement. And then you keep going as you read through the report. The principal says, well, it's pretty clear that reading recovery might be a nice program and all, but it's a new program and we operate on a kind of a first in, first out thing where if we have to cut something, we're going to cut reading recovery. It's too expensive per student. And then the last problem that the program deliverers reported was that given that it was so expensive, people just didn't think it was ever going to be cost effective. So even if you establish that it's a good program, it helps kids read, people involved in the program said, yeah, it might do that, but it's just way too expensive per student. And as a result, the reading recovery teachers figured, well, I'm just going to jump ship before the ship sinks. So in other words, it's really expensive, and even though it's great and I think it's making a difference, I'm pretty sure the district's not going to fund it, so I'm just going to jump beforehand, therefore undermining the whole thing before it's even been discovered whether it was effective or not. So you can look at reading recovery as a case study of people are reluctant to do it because it's too expensive. It's certainly too expensive per kid. And even if it was any good, the district wouldn't give us the right amount of money to implement it. And even if they did give us the right amount of money, they wouldn't keep giving us the right amount of money. And everybody knows this, so everybody's going to drop out before we've even finished the effectiveness evaluation. So kind of our overarching lesson is we think even if you don't do benefit cost or cost effectiveness analysis, it is going to impinge on your program itself. You know, abecedarian is nice and all, but everybody's just agreed it's just too expensive. It's just too much. And so we really should have thought of that in the first place, maybe done it earlier, or even just put it into 2 bits and called it like part 1 and part 2 or something. But we think this is kind of a general lesson that we get from when we read through a lot of evaluations that do not have an economic component in them. Okay. Almost lunchtime. We had our goals, and where I grew up, you score goals. That's how goals are scored. You meet goals. We score goals. Our first goal was to say, let's just get our very basic table, C, E, B, put them together in like grade school math of a table, like those tables we had, so we can understand what we've got at the end, even though there's going to be a lot of paddling underwater. The second thing that we said we were going to do is we had to put this in our theory of change, and the reason we had to do that is because we needed to know what costs we were going to include, where our benefits measures were going to come from, where our effectiveness measures were going to come from. And even though it sounds pretty basic, it was a virtue for us to try to keep this simple. And one reason is because even if it sounds complicated for one program, a lot of this is supposed to help policymakers make decisions, and so you end up having different programs to compare, and if all the evaluations are different, as you know, you can offer a policymaker 2 choices, and they've no way of choosing between the 2 because they're just so differently structured, the policies that are being offered.
Read my report and then do whatever the hell they were going to do in the first place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, where on earth they got that from, we're not really sure, but it was probably from something that was easy for them to understand. And then the last thing we want to do is we really want to make this about policy making and making decisions. And that, in a lot of ways, just say to us, are we really worried about statistical significance? But it also says, if we really wanted to influence policy, we have to have a really good theory of change here, because this theory of change is going to tell us how many benefits we can have. So Perry Preschool would have been dead in the water without its effects on the criminal justice system. Well, you better have a good theory of change here for how that works. And you could think about abecedarian as not having the same influence, not having the same theory of change to go through it. Now, that was a lot. It seemed like a lot. It was like 4 big things. And we'll talk more about statistical significance because it makes a difference for cost effectiveness and benefit cost analysis. So it's going to take us a little bit of a while.